morning, everyone, and welcome to our December 1st program. I am Connie Engel. I'm with Childress Klein and Renaissance Bank, and on behalf of the board of NACD Atlanta, I'd like to welcome you to this expert series event brought to you by Northern Trust. You'll be able to see who else is on board in the chat room. Just want to give you that detail. And at the same time, thanking Northern Trust, want to also thank all of the chapter sponsors who we are so grateful to. And but today especially, this expert series event is being brought to you by Northern Trust. And oh, by the way, for some of you, we got lucky and got this wonderful mug, beer, whatever you want to put in it, from Northern Trust. So with that and the Panera Bread, I'm going to go have a very nice pastry today after this meeting is over. First, I want to get started by introducing you to Glenn Weiss. Glenn is the head of the Atlanta office for Northern Trust and has over 25 years of experience in the financial services industry. And I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to introduce you to the panel. But I want you all to know that Glenn will have a very big smile on his face today because his Louisiana State University got Brian Kelly yesterday from Notre Dame. So just to kick off, maybe Glenn, you might like to speak to that, or maybe not. I totally get it. But anyway, thank you so much for everything that you've done for us. We are so grateful that you're a fairly new sponsor with us. So Glenn, take it away.
Connie, thank you for that. And yeah, being an LSU Tiger right now is a good thing for college football, I hope. So for those of you who don't know Northern Trust, we are a premier wealth management firm founded 130 years ago. And we have worked with generations of families and advisors offering fresh perspectives and creative thinking backed by leading edge technology. And our company was based on really three principles: service, expertise, and integrity. And those principles have recently been recognized by the Financial Times Group as the best private bank for the 11th time in 13 years. So we're really proud of that honor that we have achieved. And we're really proud to be part of NACD and offering programs like this. We are truly excited to have this timely program moderated by our own community advisory board member, Virginia Hepner. Virginia has served in the financial services and non-for-profit arena for many years here in Atlanta and currently serves on 3 corporate boards. Virginia, thank you so much this morning for leading us in this discussion. And I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. So nice to have been invited to facilitate this conversation. And if you serve on a board or you're an investor, there's probably not a hotter topic than ESG as a broad bucket of issues. And today we want to focus on one of the really critical ones, which is around executive compensation. And particularly if you're serving on a board now, I think we're all keenly interested in the evolution of the topic, but also how to be a great board member and employ best practices. And today we are really fortunate to have 2 speakers who know all about best practices in this arena. And you have their bios, but I'll welcome to the screen Devin Blackburn, who serves as the in a national role for Northern Trust Wealth Management. She monitors all the tax legislation and is in charge of executive wealth, so senior vice president and counsel. She's a Kansas City native, where I grew up, so we won't talk about Midwest football. We'll stay focused on the Southeast. But Devin, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for getting up so early for us on the Midwest time. So we appreciate it. And also joining us, John Nixon, a partner in Duane Morris, also equally experienced lawyer and expert in this field as a employee benefits and exec comp specialist. And John, you're joining us from Philadelphia, my alma mater, UPenn, which we won't talk about the Quakers either. So we'll
Good to
thank
know,
you for
Virginia.
joining
Good to know.
I know. The Fighting Quakers, kind of an oxymoron, but you know, we'll focus on LSU today in your honor. You're an LSU Louisiana native, I understand.
Yes.
So thank you both for joining us. And just for the audience members, let you know that please put some questions in the chat and we'll try to follow them. But at the end of the program, we'll have a few extra minutes for Q&A. So please feel free to stay on for that. So we'll launch into the topic. And John, let's start with you. What's the view of proxy advisors on the integration of ESG into comp plans now? Please give us the current status.
Absolutely, and that's a great question to start with, Virginia. As you all know, the proxy advisory field is kind of dominated by two players, ISS and Glass Lewis, and ISS in particular has been very forward with its approach in evaluating ESG in the comp context. They produce what they call their quality index score, where they sort of go through each element of ESG and determine how a given corporation and a given comp committee has incorporated those factors. So some of this stuff is almost easy. Like on the environmental side, I mean, there's been a lot of data out there, and everyone knows sort of the plays of zero emissions and carbon footprint. So that is an area where there's a lot of both empirical data and a well-established metrics. Governance, to the same degree, also has a lot in the way of established criteria. So, they're looking at aspects like board refresh. They're beginning to incorporate the diversity of the board, both gender and racial diversity of the board. And that's going to tie into something we're going to discuss a little bit later when we get to Nasdaq. The degree of independence in the committee. These are all factors that they sort of kind of generally put into the box of governance. The social piece is a little newer to the equation. So you're looking at DE and I, and you're trying to figure out how do you quantify DE and I. And this is an area where you have the proxy advisory firms, you have the comp consulting firms, and they're sort of working together to try to figure out, okay, is there a way that we can take these factors and utilize them in the comp determination? Are they sort of a plus to the comp determination? Or are you doing 80% of sort of traditional metrics, and now you're saying, okay, we're going to reserve 20% for this ESG component? So the proxy advisory firms are creating a framework, but probably the most significant thing they're doing is they're identifying not necessarily targets, but they're identifying categories where there could be areas of improvement. The other big thing that you're going to be concerned about, and that any director is going to be concerned about, is disclosure. Again, separate and apart from Nasdaq, the comp committees and the CDNAs that can really have a robust disclosure discussion of what they're doing on ESG will sort of be forward thinking on this. So it is definitely evolving, and we've had a number of things that have come out of Washington and from the exchanges that have pushed that evolution, but it's still evolving.
Great, thank you. That's a great summary. Devin, with so many companies becoming focused on long-term sustainability and ESG, what role do you see investors playing in this and other stakeholders in the increased focus?
Thank you so much for that question, Virginia. And I think you really have to think about that holistically. So if you think about America, there's really been a strong movement behind the idea that the free market has significant responsibility to influence and lead societal change. And that movement really ramped up in the past 18 to 20 months, right? We had the pandemic, the resulting economic recession, and social unrest. And so corporate boards have faced this growing demand to just do more. And that demand is from all stakeholders, right? So you mentioned what investors and stakeholders, but it's every facet of society. So it's shareholders, activists, senators, regulatory bodies, end user customers even. And they're all demanding corporate ESG responsiveness beyond your typical clean water or cutting carbon emissions or energy. And so the focus is now shifting on how people are impacted, the companies, people, and society as a whole. And so companies are being held to this enhanced standard, but a company is a company, right? So in turn, they're putting it on leaders at the helm, the executives. And so as the old saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. And so there's that pressure from investors and stakeholders. So the idea of value creation, it's shifted. It's shifted beyond revenue and to people, with the idea being that if you create value for all those stakeholders that I named, internally and externally, then you can increase the revenue and increase earning potential. So that's what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing.
Yeah, it's performance plus, right? I mean, I think we have to still have financial performance, otherwise we'll bear the brunt of that issue, but it's plus. And I think we have to recognize and not be in denial about it. And John, you, I know you're deeply involved in a lot of Fortune 500 clients and smaller companies, but any insights from current examples? I'm thinking of the Exxon issue, and maybe you could highlight what the issues there, in case anyone missed it. I can't imagine they did.
Absolutely. And while I was not personally involved in that, I did have the opportunity to have a discussion with Engine One, the activist firm that brought about the changes in Exxon's board. And as a brief sort of overview, I think probably everyone knows the story, but earlier this year, Engine One started a proxy campaign to replace a number of directors of Exxon. And they made it pure and simple that this was about Exxon's environmental policies. And they thought that a board change would accelerate Exxon's adoption of alternate sources and bring Exxon in with its competitors where it had unfortunately fallen behind. And what is what's interesting is I spoke to 3 executives at Engine One to discuss their driving force around this. And be clear, these people are not. This is about total shareholder return. This is about them using their activist format to get into a company where they thought there was underperformance, and that underperformance just happened to coincide with an environmental issue. And it tied in both the environmental piece and the governance piece, because what they ultimately argued was you do not have directors who have experience in alternative energy. And we have a proposed slate that does. So it was clearly about driving an environmental policy and what they thought would be a beneficial return environmental policy through a change in governance. And really what carried the day for them is they went to the 3 big ETFs, Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock. And once they got them on board, that was it. It was done. So when it is somewhat, the story reads like, oh yeah, these do-gooders came in and they took on Exxon. Be clear, it wasn't about taking on Exxon merely because of a tree-hugging mentality. It was about going in and driving a company toward an area where they thought there was an opportunity for increased performance and shareholder return.
That's a great insight, because honestly, in the press, it read much more around environmental activism And yet it's really talking about expertise on the board, and is the
Exactly.
company employing expertise properly? I appreciate those insights. Devin, how are you and Northern Trust advising your clients around ESG, especially around S? Because as you mentioned before, some things are easier to measure, some are not, but we need to anticipate what might be changing. So talk a little bit about that with us.
Absolutely. So I think for us to advise our investors and our clients, we had to determine and really understand how ESG investing was changing. So think back, and I have some figures here. 5 years ago, investors contributed $5 billion to sustainable funds. In 2019, that number was 21 billion. And last year in 2020, that figure more than doubled. So in 2020, funds with an ESG strategy took in more than 50 billion in new assets. And that growth is expected to continue because investors now want their portfolios to better reflect their values. So there's interest and intent, but when it comes to actually acting on this preference, very few investors make their investment decisions based on ESG criteria because they just don't know how. So to answer your second question, the way Northern Trust is advising clients on this issue, there's 3 distinct areas. So first, we developed the Northern Trust ESG Vector Score. And so that focuses on the magnitude and direction of all key ESG related business issues, the environment, the social, the governance, and how it's likely to have a financial impact on companies that you're investing in, and ultimately the portfolio's performance. And then secondly, we are fiduciaries, right? We're trustees, just as Glenn mentioned. And so oftentimes the beneficiaries of the trust, that new generation, remember he said multi-generation?
Yeah.
Those new beneficiaries, they want ESG investments, but the grantors, the people that actually set up the trust, that funded the trust, created the trust, they don't want that at all, right? So we've created a process to help clients come to a consensus on values and sustainable objectives. And then the last development is our internal sustainable investing ESG advisor guide, right? And it's sort of something that I would imagine boards would put in place. And so we developed that for our wealth advisors, our portfolio managers, our trust advisors, so they can advise specific client personas. They can advise the business owners who are wondering how to integrate ESG into their privately owned company. They can advise the widow who's now making decisions about inherited wealth and wants to make an impact. And they can advise the corporate executive, which I'm over, who needs to determine how ESG may impact their incentive plan, not only their short-term incentive plan, but their long-term plan, right? That's going to impact long-term asset sufficiency. And so that internal guidance, again, that ensures our partners are able to provide the right advice regarding ESG, not only to their investment clients, but those particular client personas that have other holistic needs.
All the stakeholders. I so identify, and probably everybody on the screen identifies with the next generation questions. I would never have thought to ask questions that my children asked to my father or mother about, their investing criteria, and now mine are definitely involved, which is a good thing. It's a good thing, but it just adds pressure to the topic.
I mean, it's literally changed how we do business and how we advise. It literally has changed. I mean, literally in the last 18 months,
Right. Wow. John, you still got to run the company, so the board still has to make decisions around compensation,
Right.
even if new rules and regs don't exist. So how do you see ESG factoring in compensation matrix right now? What are some of the things that you see?
Well, it's I like to think of compensation as an ecosystem where you have the comp committee, you have the consultant, you have the executives, you have sort of the proxy advisory firms out there, and ultimately you have the stakeholders, and they're all they're all in the mix together. A lot of what is being driven is coming from the comp advisory firms as they have sort of tried to develop a matrix for this, with the understanding, right, that this is a significant shift from the traditional, total shareholder return, the sort of clear objective matrix that historically exists. So if you sort of look at the factors, I mean, governance has always been there. Governance has always been something that you could point to, you could identify good practices, and you could say, okay, this is what makes for good governance. This is what makes for good, good board and senior executive behavior. We can establish that. The environmental piece, again, you're sort of taking existing criteria and you're repurposing it for, your ESG disclosures. The tough part, again, the tough part is the S. And someone referred to it as sort of stirring with a longer spoon. I mean, you have to dig deeper down into the company and look at employment practices, look at labor practices, look at how DE&I, to the extent that that is one of the principal drivers, how does that manifest itself throughout the hierarchy of the company? And that's one of the things that you're seeing the comp consultants sort of try to figure out. And then once you figure that out, or at least once you establish a criteria, the question then becomes, how much does it go to the increase leveling of compensation? To Devin's point, what gets measured gets done. Well, now that you're measuring it, the question is, how much are you going to have it impact the compensation discussion? And that's a very fluid discussion. Part of that fluidity is based on industry. Part of it's based on, sort of the historical trends in that industry. And you're seeing different answers for different types of companies within different industries.
John, it strikes me, because I've been on public boards for about over a decade. And as a director, I was always very careful to recognize what's different. I'm not the management.
Right.
I'm a director. But it strikes me that all of this area of examination requires the board members to go even deeper into, for example, HR practices, beyond the executive team. And I'm assuming you're seeing that.
Yes, we are seeing that. And that's the sort of reporting has become more robust. And, as I mentioned, we're now looking sort of throughout the enterprise. How is representation throughout the enterprise? Because look, listen, you've got to have that stage of that level of executives under the C-suite, because they are presumably going to be your successors.
Pipeline. It's the pipeline. And when you ask and try to address the question of why isn't there more diversity, however you define it, well, if you don't look at the pipeline, you can't really address
Exactly.
I'm looking at a couple of questions in the chat, and Devin, this question is for you from Becky Blaylock. She said, how does Northern determine if a company is focused on sustainability? What metrics do you point to, and do you depend on proxy advisors?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So our methodology really marries two leading sustainability reporting frameworks, right? The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board standards, which are industry specific. And we also look at the thematic structure of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And so there's another comment up here of how do we make sure we don't fall prey to greenwashing?
Right.
This is based on data. It's based on other standards within these particular industries. It's not all based on whatever Northern Trust thinks. So there's a diversity of the methodology there as well.
I mean, it's until you have more defined metrics that everyone must adopt, you're still going to have to do deep.
Yeah. And so it also looks at, again, the environment, social capital, human capital aspects, business model and innovation, leadership and governance.
So speaking of governance, John, what do you see as likely legal challenges to a board or the comp committee's utilization of ESG? Are you seeing that, and what should we anticipate?
We haven't seen it yet, Virginia, but I've been practicing for over 30 years, and I tell people you could get sued for anything. There are enough lawyers out there starving that someone will find a reason to sue you.
Talking to
So
two lawyers, I recognize.
yes.
So,
But the and really when you're talking about compensation, it really is more art than science. So as long as you can establish procedural prudence on how you came about your methodology, then it is really, really difficult for someone to say that compensation structure, which incorporates certain ESG factors, is a detriment to me as an employee or me as a stakeholder of the company. One of the things that we're seeing, and that has always been an issue, is in the investor class. When you talk about, for example, I do a lot of work with public sector pension funds, which are among the largest investors. And the mantra there is appropriately, exclusive benefit of the participants, and making certain that it is all about return. So a lot of when you see, for example, the U.S. Department of Labor coming out with guidance on when it's appropriate to take these factors into account, that a lot of folks thought would set the table for litigation, not necessarily someone suing the company, but someone suing the Pennsylvania Teachers Fund for picking firm X versus firm Y because they like firm X's ESG portfolio. And those questions is, are you making a decision that is based on factors other than shareholder return? That creates something of an avenue for litigation. But I think boards, I think their advisors, I'm an advisor to public funds as they sort of work through this, and an advisor to companies as they work through this. We focus on establishing procedures where we could justify the decision. We could say the decision was consistent with the Department of Labor standards, it's consistent with good investment practices, consistent with diversity, and it's consistent, most importantly, with shareholder return. Now, the fact that ESG is part of that discussion doesn't detract from it. In fact, it adds to it. So again, haven't seen a lot of litigation. You may see some litigation, but I think it's going to be really, really hard for someone to mount a case against a comp committee based on its incorporation of ESG factors.
Do you agree, Devin, for that? You're on mute, Devin.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When I think about the legal considerations that board members need to be aware of, I don't immediately go to litigation. I think about the specific documentation, right? Reviewing current documentation, reviewing processes, making certain whether current short-term incentive plans or long-term incentive plans even permit the use of ESG metrics, right? What about the award agreements? In case that amendments are necessary. And then also looking at committee charters to confirm whether duties should be expanded to account for the incorporation of ESG metrics. I know Uber recently revamped all of their committees, and different committees now are responsible for environmental, social, governance, safety of drivers and riders. And then from a legal perspective, I would think is important are disclosures, right? So the regulatory landscape for ESG disclosures is ripe for change. So it's difficult to predict really what types of disclosures will be mandated by law or that will evolve as best practice. But
best practice, yeah.
I think in June, the House of Representatives passed the ESG Disclosure and Simplification Act, right? And that would require that the SEC creates a standard definition of ESG metrics as a part of an ESG disclosure requirement. And SEC has been repeatedly calling for change. So while this year we may not see major regulatory changes implemented, I think boards really can expect that change in the future.
Right.
And it's just to lay the groundwork for that now.
I think a real serious charter review is well underway. Sorry, go ahead.
And
Go ahead.
and if I could add something to that, I mean, when the SEC mandated discussion and analysis disclosures, we were all scrambling to figure out what would that look like? What would that look like? I read a ton of proxies. CDAs all read the same. They all read the same. They all look exactly the same. They all have the same pie charts. They all have the same tables.
Right.
I mean, the tables are mandated, but everything about them is the same. You could just, so something will evolve. And once it does evolve, it will become the standard. And then it's going to be a question of, are you going to be an outlier by not adhering to the standard?
Right. So we've been talking about ESG more biased toward public companies. Talk about the application in private companies and what you're seeing in compensation. John, what's your view?
Well, from a private company standpoint, if I could be a bit cynical this early in the morning, let's start with the exit, right? Let's start with the exit, because that's really what everyone cares about. And the question is, are you positioning yourself? One of the fundamental questions is, are you positioning yourself to exit to a strategic buyer or to an investment buyer? I mean, and a financial buyer. And if you are going to a strategic buyer, if you think that's really where you're going, then you know what industry you're going to be in. You know what players are out there, and you know what their ESG template portfolio expectations are. So you build yourself into that. Okay.
Really?
Now, if you think it's more likely than not, you're going to go to a financial buyer or maybe even a SPAC, it's good. It's good to do because you want to have as wide appeal as possible. But I don't think that particular private company is going to be as focused on it. So I hate to be cynical about it, but that's
probably realistic.
That's kind of where it lands.
Right. Devin, you agree with that?
Yeah, so when I think back to, or when I think about non-public board committees, my mind immediately goes to our private company business owner clients. And to us, they're beginning to embrace how to deal with ESG considerations at their companies. And quite frankly, many of them recognize the importance of supporting various ESG causes within their businesses, but they don't know how again. And so where we start with them is building or even modifying existing corporate governance framework of their businesses, again, to cultivate and sustain ESG over the long term. And to John's point, in order to potentially position them for an exit or an acquisition.
I think you'd also have, as a private company, there's family next generation issues, right? And as we talked about before, as an investor, that generation may have really different views on what the priorities are.
Or Virginia, that next generation may be in another industry. They may not be in the business, right?
Out.
So that's why, again, a lot of our private business owners are having to come up with this corporate governance structure and position the business to be led by maybe an existing employee or an outsider.
Right. John, and it's really a related topic in the M&A world. Are you seeing the board's role in evaluation differ with different corporate corporate formations, as well as the ESG factor in M&A? Are you seeing that now?
Not really. I mean, in a perfect world, I wish I could say I was, but when we get to deal points, we're just negotiating the deal
money.
And the money. It's about the money.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We'll see. Yeah. We don't want to be too cynical this morning, John, but we are capitalists on the call, and it's really about short-term, long-term, and what issues really drive value, and what are we doing?
And again, I mean, I think as a board member, if I'm sitting in that discussion, you do have an obligation to your shareholders, and unfortunately, at that point, your obligation becomes very narrow and very focused, and within that fairway, it is about best price. So, it just isn't part of the main conversation.
Well, I mean, and obviously, if there's stock deals, you're trying to evaluate, what's the true value, right? What's the future value? Cash is much easier to describe. So what about the Nasdaq rule on diversity? Devin, do you, I know we've talked about this before, does that have any impact on the ESG discussion?
I think so, right? Because I think boardroom diversity is going to enrich discussions, number one, right? So you get diversity of thought, diversity of experience, because ESG is like an elephant. There's so many components, right? So some directors may be focused on the trunk, while others are focused on the tail. Like someone just stated, how can you prevent this greenwashing? And so that diversity in the boardroom is going to follow an environment where conventional views may be challenged. So think about it. If you walk into a room where everyone has a similar background from the same place, same school, thinks like you, you're likely to assume that everyone views the issues similarly as you do. And you believe it will be easy to sell your idea and point of view. But if you know you're going to enter a room or board meeting where people are different, well, you know you're going to likely have to do some convincing. So you're going to prepare more before the meeting, deliberate more. Actions and pitfalls are likely to surface. And so there's really good evidence to speak to the benefits of board diversity and that it improves every and just overall decision making. And I think something to really take a look at is Uber's most recent ESG report, right? So they have a very diverse board and they have made specific, very specific, measurable, long-term incentive connected to executive comp that have they're very big measurements, like 25% directly tied to diversity. And within 3 years, women in management group, diversity hires grew. And we're talking about people that actually work at Uber, not Uber drivers or anything like that. So it actually, it's starting to work. Like the proof is in the pudding in some of these boards.
Yeah, well, just the latest reports in terms of, really significant increase in diversity over the last 2 years, really on Fortune 500 and Russell 2000 companies, but it's still roughly a third of the companies. So I just wanted to note for the audience that Devin posted their methodology for Northern Trust. So make sure and look at that if you have an interest. And Betsy asked a question for the upcoming proxy season. How would you recommend companies detail of disclosures, conservative or expanded in proxy and or sustainability reports? John, do you have a comment on that?
That's an excellent question, and I've been thinking about that a lot myself. One of the things that once you put it in the proxy, you have put a target on your back. And, again, not to be cynical, but you want to make certain that you don't get out over your skis and put something as sort of a sustainability objective or an environmental objective that may or may not be attainable, because that will ultimately come back to senior management, that will come back to the board. And the question is, do you want to be a leader in this space or do you want to be a close follower? I think right now, as we sit here in December of 2021, I'm kind of looking to be a close follower. Uber set a template that I think is very good, and you could learn a lot from that template. But if you can't do it, then you perhaps shouldn't mention it in your proxy. But if you think it's there, then fine. And there are other companies out there that are being more forward thinking. But you really have to look at what are your industry peers doing and what you can reasonably attain.
Yeah. What do you want to say that's aspirational as well versus hold yourself accountable to it?
Exactly.
And it's a moving target. Well, just in the few minutes we have left, love your closing thoughts on what we should be thinking about as board members on related ESG and sustainability topics. What advice do you have for us today?
Yeah, Virginia, I'll give it a go. So I think the first thing is just to anticipate change, right? Really among the board governance structure. So again, think back to our Uber example. They completely revised the charters of each board committee. And there are studies out there. So a Willis Towers Watson survey found that the largest companies in the S&P 500, right? More of them now have standalone ESG committees, right? So they increased from like, I think less than 10% in 2015, and now it's almost 20%, right, today. So that's the thing, be really prepared for that change. And then I'd say also anticipate challenges, right? So that same survey found that I think about maybe 30 or 40% of boards plan to tie ESG metrics to executive pay by 2022. Again, selecting the right ESG metrics is difficult. If you think about Nike, earlier this year, Nike, McDonald's, Starbucks, they all made very big pronouncements that they were going to be directly tying diversity, equity, inclusion, but they made the announcements, but they didn't say how they were going to measure it, right? And that's the tough part. That's the really tough part. So I think one of your challenges is going to be target setting, performance measure identification, performance measure definitions. I think the last other thing is just really start to lay the groundwork now for what disclosures could be, what disclosures are going to look like. John said, be a follower in this space. So I think, again, there's really three things there. There's that board governance change, there's the challenges, setting targets, and getting ready for increased disclosures.
Thank you. I want to go back and I'll just be thinking about this question about, interested to hear your views on any anticipated changes from the SEC. I haven't read of any, and I know there are new appointments pending on some of these governing boards, and love your perspective on that. But, John, what's your advice in terms of anticipation of topics?
I would to pick up on Devin's three-part analysis. I would ask yourself three questions as a director. Are you in an industry that has certain metrics that lend themselves to being quantifiable and therefore incorporated in an ESG disclosure that is attainable? That's the first. Second, have your investors publicly declared concern? All right. BlackRock has made it clear, Larry Fink has made it clear that he cares about this. And if he's a holder, then you better respond. You better respond. And the third is optics. We mentioned greenwashing. As the assessment of this becomes more refined and more nuanced, there will be firms that will begin to separate the real, sort of the true believers and the sincere applicants of ESG versus those who are merely, showing optics. I mean, if you want to look for a generation, my wife is a trustee of a university, and they protest all their trustee meetings because, you're invested in fossil fuels, you're invested in this. And, a 20-year-old with a lot of time on her hands can be a real tough activist. So you need to be cognizant of that. Are you really doing it? And do you have a real narrative that will withstand scrutiny?
That is really helpful. Just back to, and we're going to shift now to Q&A portion. So those of you who can stay on, welcome to either put your question in chat or raise your hand. And if I could just start with that question, are you seeing any changes or pending anticipated changes from the regulatory bodies that we all are looking to? Anything that we should be alert to?
Well,
Yeah, so Virginia, go ahead.
Go ahead, Devin, you first, then John.
So again, that House bill, it's still in the House, hasn't passed the Senate. So that's one. But the biggest thing from the SEC, what I'm seeing that they're really focused on right now is revamping 10b5-1 plans. And again, that doesn't have anything to do with ESG, but I think that's going to be the SEC's agenda for next year, which again, with executive wealth, we do a lot of 10b5-1 plans, which is what I've been following. So when I look at the SEC press releases and the prepared remarks that are often posted online, again, that's what I keep seeing. I just haven't heard anything about these mandating these disclosures since June, right? I think everybody's so busy with tax legislation and everything else.
Thank you.
Well,
John?
and on the investor side, the biggest thing to come out is the Department of Labor recently revised this guidance on ESG investing. And you can, it's almost, I mean, you could sort of set your watch to it that when a Republican administration is in place, there is a sort of a disdain and a sort of a narrowing of taking ESG into consideration. And when a Democratic administration is in place, it expands. So in the last days of the previous administration, there was a significant tightening of the ability to take ESG into account, both in investing and in exercise of proxy rights, proxy voting rights. Then later, back in August, the DOL came out and said that ESG factors could be used as a determinant in evaluating the suitability of an investment. Again, they clarified the bottom line is, you know, the investment performance as it relates to the risk return characteristics of that particular entity in that particular asset class, but they said ESG could be a consideration in making that evaluation. They also allowed for ESG to be a consideration in determining whether or not to exercise proxy voting rights. Now, this applies to ERISA-covered pension plans, okay? So we're talking private sector pension plans. Doesn't apply to governmental plans, doesn't necessarily apply to IRAs, but that sort of sets the table for what is best practice. And I advise public and private plans, but I can guarantee you my public plans cover this and watch that DOL guidance as closely as my private plans.
That is very helpful. Thank you. We're going to turn, anyone in the audience have questions? Either raise your hand or put it in the chat. We'll definitely stay on. And we know we committed to kind of finish the formal conversation at 9:15, and we pay attention to those guidelines. Devin and John, I've learned a lot from you, both in prep for this discussion, but also things to be concerned about in the upcoming board meetings I have. So it's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for the
Absolutely.
opportunity. And I'm definitely learning a ton as well. And I encourage anyone to reach out to me if you take a look at our methodology and have any questions. I and Glenn would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Right. Thank you.
So not hearing any other questions. Going once, going twice. I just want to say thank you to Virginia, Devin, and John for just an excellent program this morning. I think this is an emerging topic that continues to develop over time, and I think you've given us some good framework to be thinking about this. And so thank you, NACD, for the platform, and thank you again, panelists. We really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great day.
I think we're turning to Betsy Camp, I think.
Betsy?
On behalf of the Atlanta chapter, this has been an absolutely wonderful, informative, and very timely presentation. And I thank you so much, Virginia, Devin, and John. You were excellent in every way. And I thank you, Glenn. We really value our sponsorship relationship with you and look forward to more interactions. For the participants, we seek feedback for what we do. We want to be constantly improving. There is a survey in the chat link. If you would take, it's very short. If you would take some time to get that back to us, it's pretty simple. And then I understand that for those people who may want to have a conversation with the panelists, if you stay on, the presentation will go into a breakout room. And so you can do that then. And for those of you who can't, I just want to say thank you for coming. I hope you got as much out of this as I did, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Betsy.
Okay.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you.
All right. Lenora, how is this going to work? please stay in the main room and we'll be transferred to the breakout room.
We are not going to go to breakouts, Betsy. We're all going to stay together.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Glenn, I
for
will
anyone-
miss Coach O's "Go Tigers" at the end of every game. That I'll miss.
He is unique in his conversation.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's great. Well, anyone who wants to have a conversation, I see Robin and Carol on the thing, just unmute and have any discussion you want to have. And if y'all have done such a great job of presenting this, you know, there may be questions, most of which have been answered, but it's been a great overview of the situation and the dynamic nature of this area and its importance. So, okay, well.
Betsy, hey Betsy, I have a question. This is Carol.
Hi, Carol.
I'm curious, and the experiences of this group may be really relevant. In one situation I'm involved in, we actually went to the investors using our investor relations component to the surveys, and really focused on the unique elements of ESG as it related to what really were our investors interested in, right? In terms of, if you think about it, I'm just curious, are there other boards or other directors who have had companies that they've seen that information? That was actually sponsored by one of the board committees and then reported back to the board committees. I'm just curious because I think part of the question around disclosure gets into the types of elements you would consider disclosing and then what elements are really important to your industry. So I'm just curious if others have even taken that step, and if you have, how from a governance standpoint are you sort of managing the information? Hope that's an acceptable question in this environment.
Oh, I think, Carol, I think it's a wonderful question. On one of my boards last year, we had an activist come in, shareholder activist, not really just representing a couple of investors, and demand that we publish our EOC1 metrics in the proxy, which are, you know, your company's profile racially and by gender, and also divided into general and leadership, which is not something that we did. And we never had any issue with our shareholders wanting that information, but we put it in the proxy and expected that it wouldn't be recommended that they not vote in favor of it. And to our immense surprise, 76% of our shareholders voted for the proposal. So, and I think that's a common thing. The shareholder activist group was called As We Sow, and they're on the West Coast, you know, typical progressive group. And our understanding was they submitted this proposal to the top 250 companies in the market, I mean, in the US, and pretty much setting a standard for what you got to disclose. So yeah, that would be my experience. Anybody else?
Out of curiosity, Betsy, do you recall how your larger institutional shareholders voted on that?
Yeah, so it's the ones you would expect.
It's okay. BlackRock,
and
State
so
Street,
forth. But
Vanguard.
basically, our top 20 shareholders, there was only one that didn't vote for it, and
Wow.
it was Mario Gambelli, and he just loves our company and doesn't want us to get, you know, distracted from our main mission. But everybody else did. It surprised the hell out of us. So.
Carol, good
So-
morning. It's nice to see you. my experience, if I heard your question right, one of my companies, we have started a regular quarterly outreach led by the investor team to talk to our top investors and about really all these topics. And this is a company that went public 3 years ago. And so we've been very focused on improving best practices on governance, et cetera. So we get, the positive check marks, but it is now evolving and our board is much more diverse. So we're getting, I think we're going in the right direction. But now we're getting, I think, the brass tack questions about the next level of analysis, some of which I think you and Betsy just highlighted. So I think it's coming. And I think we're just trying to manage it and stay close to our main, and it's like most companies, institutionally held, controlled. So,
John, appreciated your extensive comments today. I think most of them were very insightful, and I think we learned a lot. So my question, I guess, was that we have if you have competitive labor markets, competitive product markets where companies have to go out and compete for the best employees, sell in markets where customers have many options, including issues around environment. Most rational managerial decision making will have to pay attention to issues that employees care about, customers care about, their communities care about. And with that care, they will, even if they're focused exclusively on long-term shareholder value, they will incorporate the interests of the employees and customers and the environment in that calculation. So I think while ESG is useful parameters to be looking at, I think we heard some comments from your other speaker about the problems of measuring ESG. Whereas if you're looking at long-term shareholder value, at least the measurement issue is less problematic.
I would agree with that. I mean, you can make the case, and it should be an intuitive case, but it isn't necessarily, that over the long span, over the long-term time horizon, there are certain forces that we see occurring, and it's hard to narrow those down to a specific metrics that you could apply today, but we all see them occurring. We see demographic changes, we see environmental changes, we see changes in climate and change, and all of these things have a long-term impact. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, in the BlackRock letter is repeated, that if you are only measuring to a short-term metrics, eventually you're going to fall off a cliff. So that's the struggle, because listen, I mean, I'm a manager, I'm on the board, and I'm in leadership of my law firm. Every year we close the books at 12/31, and that's how we get paid. So we're sitting there saying, okay, well, but how do we make ourselves a firm of choice and a profitable firm in 2035? And it's a struggle, but I'll use an HR practice as an example. Years ago, our younger attorneys said, we don't need to come into the office every day. And the, more gray-haired folks like me said, I came into the office every day when I was 26, and you're going to come into the office every day. Well, guess what? You cannot compete in the labor market today if you tell a 27-year-old that they have to be in an office every day. Mm-hmm. Now, had we been on the forefront of that in 2015, we'd be golden now. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe that's unique to law firms, but I think that that message can kind of transmit.
Thanks, John. I think, Carol, your question about, or I think Betsy also mentioned that you would ask groups of investors, your shareholders, about their preferences on various ESG set of issues. So, I think as you probably found out, there is no one shareholder viewpoint. The shareholders, you may have, in fact, as many viewpoints as you have shareholders. And at least with regard to environmental issues, European institutional investors are much more active and have a much stronger opinions than in general US institutional investors. So, you have to think about, do we want people from other places tell us how we should be running our business here? And then also, one of the issues that gets ignored when you're talking about shareholder democracy, which is fine, that there you have one share, one vote, and that exacerbates the concerns about inequality that we have in the S part of the ESG. So, you may have an individual that owns a lot of shares that has a certain viewpoint. And then you have other individuals that own fewer shares, but have maybe a different viewpoint that, some of us might agree more with.
I think that is a wonderful way. That's a very provocative question of the how everyone gets a voice, but who gets to say what the viewpoint's going to be. And probably a great question to end our program on, because I see that we're at the bottom of the hour. And so thank you so much. Again, thank you, Northern Trust. We love you as sponsors, and we hope you'll come back. This has been a very well-received program. And so with that, I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.